As the 20th century drew to a close, a British bookstore chain decided to conduct a poll. Of all the books written in the past 100 years, it asked, which one deserved to be crowned Book of the Century? More than 25,000 ballots were cast. In America, internet bookseller Amazon.com posed an even more dramatic question. Which book was the greatest of the entire millennium? 250,000 people responded. When the votes were counted, one book topped both lists, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. An epic tale of adventure, The Lord of the Rings, has struck a resounding chord with readers since it was first published in 1954. In naming it both Book of the Century and Book of the Millennium, the public also paid tribute to its author, a man who single-handedly spawned an entire genre of modern literature. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on January 3, 1892, in Bloemfontein, South Africa. Located 250 miles southwest of Johannesburg, Bloemfontein in the 1890s was a bustling trade center, owing much of its prosperity to major diamond and gold discoveries. Tolkien's father, Arthur, had left England at the age of 34 to take a position with the Bank of Africa. Once settled with a stable career, he sent for his wife-to-be, Mabel Suffield. Mabel was an educated, cultured, and devoutly religious woman who had previously worked in Africa as a missionary. They married in 1891. A year later, J.R.R. Tolkien was born. Known to his family as Ronald, he was a small, sickly child, whose delicate health was always cause for concern, yet Tolkien's early years in South Africa were by no means uneventful.
There was one incident where a servant, an African servant, just took him on a little trip. It wasn't a kidnap or anything. It was really this beautiful baby, and I'm looking after, and off we'll go, and we'll see some of the countryside. Of course, the parents weren't aware, and they were absolutely terrified, and they thought he'd been kidnapped, and goodness knows what would happen, and some tribal atrocity. And it was nothing like that at all. There's another incident that could have more of a bearing later, which was a tarantula, a deadly spider, that was in his crib, and this could have been fatal. It wasn't. But there are, of course, spider figures in his writing, over and over again, in fact. Although he wasn't in South Africa for very long, things happened that did help to influence Lord of the Rings.
In February 1894, Tolkien's only brother, Hilary, was born. He, too, suffered from frail health. After much discussion, it was decided that Mabel Tolkien would take her sons back to England. They would return to Bloemfontein as soon as the boys were strong enough to endure Africa's hot, dry climate. And so in 1895, Mabel, J.R.R., and Hilary Tolkien left South Africa for what was supposed to be a brief separation. Alas, the Tolkien family would never be reunited.
It's amazing he was as stable as he was when we consider his early life. If a Freudian therapist was analyzing this, they would say, well, obviously he would turn out to be a serial killer or something. In fact, he was a very happy man because his parents died when he was very young. He didn't know his father. Very moving letters that his father wrote to Tolkien when Tolkien was a baby, but they never actually, there was no contact. I mean, Tolkien was a small, very small child, a baby when his father died. His mother died when he was young too. His mother was quite heroic, and she raised the boys for quite a time, but then she died too. So Tolkien was largely raised by a Roman Catholic priest. Now again, that's not fashionable, I suppose. Raised by Roman Catholic priests, goodness me, the abuse and dysfunction, but no, this was quite idyllic.
Fortunately, a kind-hearted Catholic priest named Father Francis Xavier Morgan took an interest in the boys' welfare.
He was a wonderful man who sacrificed a great deal to make sure that these two boys were raised properly with a good education. And he was controlling in a way. I mean, certainly he said to Tolkien that when Tolkien fell in love, you're going to have to wait till you get married and so on, but that was not the worst thing on earth. He was trying to take care this was a Roman Catholic priest, a celibate man trying to take care of two young men growing up. And by and large, he did the most remarkable job.
And so it was that J.R.R. Tolkien began his life. having lost his parents, but filled with wonderful visions of Africa and surrounded by a new home that would forever inspire him. Although J.R.R. Tolkien was uprooted from South Africa at an early age, he retained crystal clear memories of his native Bloemfontein. In fact, he claimed that the contrast between the desert plains of Africa and the green rolling hills of England helped stir his creative juices. Tolkien's first home in England was Sarehole, a rural village near Birmingham. As settings go, it was an almost idyllic place, with majestic elm trees, quiet rivers, and vast acres of lush farmland. In the early 1900s, Sarehole resembled a realm frozen in time, untouched by the automobiles and factories of the dawning industrial age.
Tolkien, as a boy and a young man, knew the two sides of English society, both the rural and the urban. And he loved the rural, and this comes out in his books later. So when he was a young boy, he would play in the rolling hills and the little villages and the mills that were around and the local characters. But he also knew the urban, the city centres of Birmingham and so on, and he never liked that sort of thing. In fact, it comes out again and again in the books, the sort of the smoky, dark places where the bad people live, and the open, green, bucolic areas where the good people live. Very much a reflection, I think, of his early years.
I think the English countryside is quite an influential place because it has a lot of mystery and atmosphere to it. To the west of him, he had the Welsh mountains, which was a different culture and a different language. And to the east, you got the rest of England and the English Channel, and it's sort of a very geographical kind of sort of reality-based thing happening to him.
While growing up in Sarehole, J.R.R. Tolkien became an avid reader of fantasy stories. Before his mother's untimely passing, she had instilled in the boy a love of fairy tales, nature, and classical mythology. It was an act that would have a profound impact on her son, and the stories he would pen many years after her death. If the simple life of Sarehole seemed too good to be true, that's because it was. By 1905, the city of Birmingham began to boom. Neighboring villages, such as Sarehole, would soon be absorbed and transformed into bustling suburbs. For Tolkien, his father was gone, his mother was gone, and now Sarehole, at least the Sarehole he knew and loved, was gone as well. Yet Tolkien never let life's cruel twists overwhelm him. Soon he would face even darker days, but nothing on earth, not even the horrors of war, could rob him of his vibrant and powerful imagination. Throughout his life, J.R.R. Tolkien would argue that The Lord of the Rings was not an allegory or metaphor for anything, certainly not for the two world wars, but how much of the book was inspired by his own experience and feelings about war. Tolkien was a student at Exeter College, Oxford, when the First World War broke out in 1914. A year later, he would join the army as second lieutenant in the Battalion of Lancashire Fusilier, only days after marrying his teenage sweetheart, Edith Mary Bratt, in March of 1916. Tolkien was shipped off to the front lines in France, where he would witness the terrifying Battle of the Somme. In reality, the Battle of the Somme was more gruesome slaughter than battle. More than 50,000 British troops were killed in the first day of fighting alone. Eventually, some 600,000 British soldiers would die there. An entire generation of young men wiped out. The campaign was plagued by miscalculated strategies, incompetent generals, and even hostile weather conditions. As the summer of 1916 turned to fall, the days became miserably frigid. Winter had arrived inexplicably early. Many soldiers froze to death while stationed in their filthy trenches. Tolkien, like many others, was spared, succumbing instead to so-called trench fever. Several decades later, while a Second World War once again forced Britain's sons into combat, those horrific scenes would make their way into J.R.R. Tolkien's greatest work, The Lord of the Rings.
There are very few people who came out of the First World War and said, well, there's a good war and so on. It was horrible beyond belief. This is the First World War, the Great War, the war to end wars, in fact, the war to start many of them. And Tolkien saw this, and he saw the mud and the brutality, and you see the weapons from trench warfare. Just horrible. Trenches became elaborate places where people would live underground. This came, of course, in his novels later. Great attacks of massed troops in the distance, grey, the field grey of the German army, gas attacks, and he saw all of that. It was horrible beyond belief. So many people died, entire villages disappeared in Britain. The great idea the British establishment had that if you got men from the same village to fight together, there'd be a great team spirit and they'd really help one another. They would go out to some muddy battlefield in France or Belgium and they would all die. And so you'd have a village where every man between 17 and 40 was gone. And those villages would simply collapse. So a huge influence on him because the First World War taught a lot of people a lot of things.
The Lord of the Rings was originally intended as a mere sequel. By the 1940s, J.R.R. Tolkien, who had been discharged from the army, settled into academic life as a professor at Oxford University.
The life of Oxford is strange, to say the least. Very attractive and very appealing, very compelling, but very odd as well. And there is a certain class in Britain that you have to succeed without appearing to be ambitious. Success without any effort. Tolkien was part of that group. I mean, it was esoteric academic work. He was also incredibly successful. Those around him, his friends, knew his success and they admired him for it, but many of his colleagues, people he worked with, simply they didn't acknowledge it, they didn't register it. It was irrelevant. Tolkien did have literary genius. His development of character, his understanding of character, evolution of plot, setting, this is brilliant stuff. There were a group of men, and they were men because women weren't allowed, around Oxford and Cambridge to an extent, but it was mainly Oxford, who were Christians of various denominations who wanted to get together and write and think. They were intellectuals. Two of the leading figures were Tolkien himself and C.S. Lewis. Lewis, who's famous, of course, for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Mere Christianity, and the movie Shadowlands was made about his life. And they formed a group called the Inklings, and there were anywhere between 7 and a dozen or 15 of them who would meet. They would meet in rooms in Oxford, they would meet in hotels, and in a pub in particular called the Eagle and Child, which they referred to as the Bird and Baby. And they would meet over beer and baccy, beer and tobacco, and they would discuss the issues of the day, and most important, they would discuss their own writings. So this is where Tolkien actually read chapters of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
He was gifted, as most professors are, with the ability to choose their own career and to make their interests academically, intellectually, artistically into their work, and he knew it was a privilege. What's remarkable about Tolkien is that he actually turned all of that into something enormously important for society and for people in general. He created a great book, and it was completely unexpected. There was nothing that you would find in the British academic system that would encourage people to do work such as writing, as The Lord of the Rings was called early on, a boy's adventure story. It was inappropriate. An Oxford professor is supposed to be doing academic work, scholarly work. He certainly did that. He did that in a way which established him as one of the great scholars of Old English and Middle English and the Northern European Germanic languages. He was an extremely popular teacher of Old English at Oxford. His lectures on Beowulf were standing room only. His reading of Beowulf transfixed students. But he also lived an ordinary life with great passion, and it was his victory over the limitations of the academic life that he escaped it in the evenings to write this great narrative.
He achieved success with a curious little book called The Hobbit. The Hobbit was a magical story of dwarves, dragons, and trolls that met with instant critical acclaim. For its follow-up, Tolkien would do more than write another charming tale. He would create an entirely new universe.
He originally wrote The Hobbit, the first of his books, as a children's book for his children. The Lord of the Rings is written for his children as older people, and it was written for them when at least one of them was away in the war. And into that work, he placed so much of his experience in the First World War, life experiences that he had as a scholar in Anglo-Saxon studies and studies of Old Welsh, Old Norse, Old Irish, studies that led him to formulate principles for new ancient languages which never existed.
Using the vocabulary, characters, and settings established in The Hobbit, Tolkien began work on The Lord of the Rings. When he emerged a decade later, he had written an epic narrative longer than War and Peace.
The Lord of the Rings had a profound effect on me. It was the first time I really saw the meaning of story. It's the secret of story. I found out what that little magic ring of meaning was. I don't think you can give Tolkien a big enough importance. He really brought myths forward through the fantasy genre and brought it up to date and made it alive again.
Tolkien wrote what he wrote because he enjoyed it, and when he says, I'm really a hobbit in all but size, I think it's because he loves the world he writes about. People who write about worlds they detest are troubled people. They can't be happy people. Tolkien was essentially a very happy man, and he wrote about a world that he rather liked. There was pain there and there was suffering, but in the end good does triumph and bad is defeated, and I think he rather liked that world.
The Lord of the Rings is set in an imaginary world resembling in parts the England of Tolkien's youth, only in a mysterious era thousands of years ago. It is a world populated by fanciful creatures such as evil dragons, elves, and sorcerers, or wise wizards and good-natured dwarves, all with unique names and their own language. These species coexist quite peacefully until one day they discover a ring believed to possess the power to change their world. From then on, Tolkien takes his reader on an extraordinary journey through a beautifully imagined realm as his characters struggle for control of the ring. The book's habitants soon polarize into two armed camps, ready to do battle for good or evil. The heroic tale of bravery and nobility, greed and obsession reaches its climax with a war to end all wars. With The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien had realized his dream of creating a brand new world, with all the complexities and intrigue of our own.
There are many ironies in Tolkien's life, and one of them is his American popularity, because he wrote for a British publisher. He had a personal relationship with a British publisher, and that went very well. But there was a strange absence of copyright law when it came to Britain and the US at that time. And his books were published by Ace paperbacks very cheaply in the USA, and they sold very well, but he didn't get any money from it. He was becoming incredibly popular, but receiving no money. And he was written to by people, he knew about it. Although again, this was before the direct contact between Britain and the USA. You wrote letters, it took a long time. Phone calls were very rarely made. A phone call to the USA from Britain, it wasn't really a done thing. But he found out his books were on sale there. He told his readers and friends, don't buy the books. And there was a rebellion, as it were, and then he did get a real publisher in the US who gave him royalties. But it is, as I say, deeply ironic, because he was made even more popular by the fact that he complained. And he was one of the first writers, the big-time writers, who actually complained about this, that he wasn't getting copyright from his material in the USA. I mean, this has a long history. It goes back to people like Gilbert and Sullivan, for example. Their stuff was stolen completely and was being sold in the US, and they didn't get a penny for it for the longest time. They tried to do something about it. And Tolkien actually did, not through legal efforts, just through, I think, moral imperative. People realized that he was in the right, and so a lot of authors have benefited from that.
American readers responded with a complete boycott of the Ace edition, while the Tolkien-approved Ballantine edition went on to sell more than 1 million copies.
North America was where he became famous, and this has happened to British people time and time again. He was well known in Britain, he was enjoyed in Britain, but it was North America that made Tolkien, if you like. The man we know today the success of Lord of the Rings. The Brits can be very snobbish about this sort of thing. Well, Americans this. It's the Americans who recognize his genius, actually, in large numbers. They were the ones who made him so very popular and successful and well known. And it's arguable that without that, he may have faded away. He may have had a cult following and people enjoyed him, but not the huge success we know of today.
Suddenly, J.R.R. Tolkien was a household name. The timing couldn't have been better. For within The Lord of the Rings were many messages that appealed to American students in the 1960s. For example, the book's implication that the natural kingdom should be cherished and protected was in perfect harmony with the growing ecological movement. Even the ring itself, omnipotent and potentially dangerous, was considered a metaphor for the atomic bomb.
If Tolkien were alive, he would say that The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. That's to say, you cannot take any of the creatures or the things or the actions in it as somehow representing or mapping events in the Fourth Age, the Age of Men. At the same time, he would certainly say that events repeat themselves. So what is the ring? Is it allegorically? Is it intended to be nuclear warfare? Is it intended to be evil? What is it intended to be? And many readers will want to know that, won't be satisfied until they find out. I think Tolkien will say, well, look around you. Describe to yourself where you find the ring. What is it that is obsessing you, that's threatening to destroy you as an individual?
One frequent topic for discussion is the similarities between the evil dark riders of Tolkien's story and the elite German SS of World War II. Whether the fearsome, treacherous riders were in fact based on the ruthless SS is a matter of debate.
There are characters who do seem to resemble people he knew. Obviously there are influences, even if he was completely aware of them. I sometimes think that Tolkien almost objected too much to people who said, I can see this influence in your work, and are you trying to get across this meaning and this interpretation? He would say, no, I'm just writing a book. It's fiction. It's an entertainment. Have fun with it. He was so, though, horrified by the First World War, so he didn't want to say something so dark and somber had actually influenced a book that was so beautiful and important to so many.
At campuses all across America, young readers were tuning in to The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien-esque graffiti and bumper stickers sprung up, as did discussion groups and fan societies. Back in England, Tolkien remained protective of his work, wary of academic interpretations. For him, the book's purpose was simply to delight the reader. Despite his protests, fans, scholars, and critics would continue in their attempts to decipher his stories for decades to come.
We'd like to know more about every author. We'd like to know how the author wrote the book, where the author sat. Did the author do anything to get into a writing mood? What tools did the author use? But writing is a very private process, and you really can't get into the author's mind.
Tolkien didn't write very much about his own writing process. I think he would have said, if you want to know about my writing process, read the books that I have written. It is in there. How boring, someone wanting to know how I write. He actually wasn't that disciplined. He would write when he wanted to. So there wasn't that much of a structure. Remember, he wasn't a professional writer, he was a professional teacher. But he would write at spurts. He would suddenly, the ideas would come, and he would sit down and lock himself away and write.
He worked alone. He worked without contract. He worked without hope of fame. He worked driven by the desire to tell the story. And he thought it was very important to tell this story because it had a happy ending. Tolkien said it best. He argued that escape literature ought not to be condemned. Why? He said it is the duty of an imprisoned soldier, a soldier in an enemy camp, to escape. He also argued that it's the duty, the responsibility of everyone to escape from this world into a better world.
When you read Tolkien, when you look at it, you realize that he's created the genre, or at least defined the genre. I mean, anybody now who's writing about orcs or elves or dwarves, which are very common in fantasy, is writing either casting them in Tolkien's mold, or deliberately going anti-Tolkien and doing something totally different with them. But to do something totally different, you have to know what the conventions are. I mean, Tolkien set the conventions of the genre. Every single piece of fantasy since Lord of the Rings is directly influenced by it.
Fans of The Lord of the Rings come from all walks of life. Yet, however different they may be in age, lifestyle, or place of origin, they share one common bond: a zealous passion for Tolkien's classic trilogy.
It's important to remember that Tolkien was not very well known for a large part of his life. He was a working professor, a working academic. He taught at various universities, then got to the better ones, Oxford of course, but he was just another professor, a good one, a respected one, but he would never have been known by the wider public before The Hobbit, unless The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings had been published. So he was not ambitious to be known. I mean, this is another interesting and important point. There are many writers today, if you ask them, what do you really want? Pretty soon it's, well, I want to be well known. For Tolkien, that wasn't an issue at all. He wrote because he wanted to write. He needed to write. He became well known because of it. He enjoyed his success because it gave him economic independence. They never had, the family were not wealthy, and although he was paid reasonably well as an academic, they never had that much money. And the success of his books, which was in his lifetime great, but not as great as now, with all the things that are happening, but it gave him the freedom, as money does, to do what he wanted to do. He enjoyed that. He enjoyed the fan mail. He enjoyed being successful in that way. But I don't really think he saw success as something autonomous or independent. Success for him was the success of the books, were people reading them. I mean, he was certainly delighted when children, in particular, read The Hobbit and wrote to him. That delighted him because he wanted the book to be successful. He wanted to communicate to people. And similarly with The Lord of the Rings. But I don't think he ever sat down and said, now I am successful. I mean, he wasn't a public figure. The idea of talking the public figure had no meaning to a man of his type at that time. Remember, here was a character formed in Edwardian England, conservative Roman Catholic, who wore tweeds and smoked a pipe. Suddenly he's famous. If it was today, he wouldn't be on chat shows and so on. It just wouldn't be him. He wasn't a snob. Some people think he was because he wasn't always completely at ease with the public, but that's not snobbery. He just didn't quite understand the adulation. Read my books, that's wonderful. Buy my books, that's terrific as well, but why do you want to know me? I mean, I am my books. If you want to know me, read my books. I am of no interest to you. And Britons of his era did not understand North America and North Americans. He was confused, I suppose. When people came to him and, "Are you the man who wrote these books?" he would be embarrassed. And it wasn't a question of, oh, I'm not interested. It was, oh, I don't know how to react.
Decades after its publication, the book's fan base still consists mostly of its original readers. Many baby boomers who first loved the book in the 1960s continue to explore it or pass it along to their children. The trilogy is also found in many high schools and university curriculums, where new generations of students are discovering its universal appeal.
What's amazing about Tolkien is that he had a personal loyalty to his fans, to people who read his books. Again, you see, he wrote The Lord of the Rings for an individual. He wrote it for people who had faces. He wanted to tell them a story, and his audience was always before him in his mind. So when he discovered members of that audience emerging, writing him letters, he responded. And I was one of the people he replied to. I read it in the early 60s. And overcome by the book, and seeing in it so much of the richness of English literature that I'd studied at university, in a fit of enthusiasm, I wrote the only fan letter of my life. And the miracle was that he wrote back.
Dear Mr. Lancashire, thank you very much for your kind letter. I am always pleased to hear from people who have read and enjoyed my books. I hope they will continue to give you pleasure. Yours sincerely, J.R.R.Tolkien. I much regret that I have not time for a longer answer.
Well, that was just astounding, that someone of Tolkien's talents, of his age, of his eminence, would write to an undergraduate student in the middle of the North American continent. I'm sure that he did this countless times for others. It's his personal approach to his readers, and he has a loyal following for that reason.
Some of our favorite books are the ones that create another place, and we feel as if we've been whisked away by the author's incredible introduction to that world. Those people, we feel as if we know them. We've actually been immersed in another experience reading the book. Certainly there can be an element of escapism in it.
I think that Tolkien wrote the books specifically for people to go on journeys inside of themselves. So take the book to a grassy hill under a tree, sit down and read for a couple of hours, close your eyes, and then go on your own journey. I think that's what fantasy writing is all about.
Readers need to see ordinary people, people like themselves, in tales. And once they do that, then they become entranced by them. They don't see a mirror of themselves. It's not like an autobiography, nothing like that. But they can live in the characters they're reading about. And they can see, or they can intuit somehow, that there's a similarity between what those characters go through and what they experience in daily life.
For a while, it is possible to forget who you are. It is possible to become someone else. It is possible to be part of a heroic, a mythic adventure or a quest. And I think that that is a way that can fulfill people and, in a sense, recharge their batteries. You know, it might be a kind of, it takes work and it takes creativity, it takes craft, and yet it can be a kind of vacation for parts of ourselves that may be difficult to have, encounter on a day-to-day basis.
Much like fans of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek franchise, Lord of the Rings aficionados tend toward utopian ideals. They want to believe in a universe where good will always triumph over evil. Whatever their reasons, they find within the pages of Tolkien's book a world where life is simple, with romantic quests to go on and heroic deeds to be done.
In each of the books in this series, there's someone who's a reluctant hero. None of the heroes begins on his quest with any sense of, I want to get up and leave my table and my friends and go out into the world and embark on this dangerous experience. All of them have a sense of, I'd rather not be chosen, and I'd rather stay at home and be amongst the comforts that I know. And I think that that's a very familiar feeling for many of us when we're called up to the plate to do something exceptional in life. There can be a feeling of shrinking back and not wanting to enter into it. Yet in the books in The Lord of the Rings, the heroes all ultimately go forward. It's
a singular experience. That's why I think it grips the reader so much. I mean, not only is it a huge, epic, fantastic story, but you're living every part of it. You're creating it, and you are the heroes, and you feel the deprivations of the villains. It really happens. I mean, everybody can be the king and take up the fight, and good has to triumph over evil, and it's easier then to deal with the petty mundanities of real life, because in your imagination you just took arms against the king of all evil.
Why is Tolkien so popular? I think it's because Tolkien took his work so seriously. He had a real audience in mind. It wasn't a commercial audience. It was an audience with faces. It was an audience he knew. It was people he loved. And what he was giving them was his entire life. Everything that he loved. He devoted his life to it.
To create a complete mythology for The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien invented a new alphabet, language, and race. As though that weren't enough, he was also an artist. Alongside his vivid descriptions of this unusual and engaging realm, Tolkien added his own drawings, simple depictions of his world's enchanting landscapes. In the late 70s, American twin brothers Tim and Greg Hildebrandt would bring the characters of The Lord of the Rings to life with colorful, fanciful illustrations.
The Hildebrandts created artwork which defined the look of Tolkien's vision. They created an almost jovial, animated kind of look, which I think lended itself very well to creating characters in these sort of landscapes. They read the book, they imagined what they would look like, and they created that vision. And I suppose, because they were the first to do that as well, it set the standard for sure.
Just as Tolkien's stories opened up a new world for writers, the unique style of the brothers Hildebrandt would influence an entire genre of fantasy artists.
For me, when I paint a picture, I create a story in my mind. Even if it's not a real kind of a story with a beginning and an end, I sort of create an atmosphere, a chain of events that's taking place. In fantasy art, I think it's an extension of reality. It's basically creating something from the mind which can't exist, or doesn't exist, or will never exist in reality. I'd say Tolkien has influence for sure. A great many artists. You can't really escape it in fantasy art, fantasy literature. Tolkien's influence has resonated right the way through.
Well, one thing Tolkien did, I think, which really sort of didn't just influence me, but I think influenced a lot of fantasy writers, was how he created such a sense of history to this totally imaginary world. I mean, it doesn't exist, but by the way he approached the story and told the story, there's so much more beyond what you're reading. When I started writing for The Sorcerer's Children, I found myself developing a whole history for this place because, for me, it gave this fantasy or imaginary world a greater sense of legitimacy. I would look at his characters and I would sense their sort of archetypal nature, and what it did for me was to motivate me to start looking into the mythology and even a little of the psychology, but mainly the mythology behind such archetypes. And that led me to a lot of Celtic myth, Arthurian myth. It led me on my own quest of a sort.
Fantasy artists such as the brothers Hildebrandt gave Tolkien's marvelous world pictures. Still others dreamed of transforming The Lord of the Rings into a full-scale feature film. Yet adopting Tolkien's trilogy for the silver screen seemed virtually impossible. The story's epic battle scenes and grand displays of magic made for sensational reading, but bringing them to life would prove quite a challenge for filmmakers.
The Tolkien books came out in the 50s, and since then we've seen artwork and images from the books, from himself, Tolkien, he did sketches, to other artists who've taken up the gauntlet and created these wonderful worlds on paper. And now we have the technology to do it in another medium. I remember speaking with someone 20 years ago who was looking at an illustration from a Tolkien work, and he said, wouldn't it be great if we could do movies that looked like that? Not necessarily real, but had that kind of artistic quality. And now you can. We used to say about 5 years ago that film would never die, the actual celluloid piece of film, and that actors would never be replaced by computers. But now we have films out there that are completely 100% computer graphics, and they're doing very well. They're cheaper to make than a regular film, and the audiences are buying into it. They're enjoying it. I think one of the aspects we bring to our work as visual designers, an aspect of life, is that we have to be experts in nature. We have to know how a wing moves. We have to know how water falls. We have to know what fog does when it rolls off a mountain, because these are things that are inherent in everyone's life. And if they see something that doesn't look right, they might not know what's wrong with it, but they know something's wrong. So we have to make things seem seamless. It's pretty hard to make something seem seamless when you have a character that's never existed before. But if they're distracted from that character, who's creating a main performance, by this fog bank that rolls in off a mountain that doesn't look right, you've lost the shot. How all visual effects relate to Tolkien is that, for the most part, it's about magic. And that's the essence of the Tolkien books. Creating something that hasn't been there before. He thought it had been there before. He has convinced everyone that it used to exist. So being able to create these things is pure magic. Yeah, we've gone from pulling a rabbit out of a hat on a stage to pulling dinosaurs out of the treetops.
Something that I think that is really crucial when dealing with these characters is that they're not just something we're looking at. They're not just rubber and glue. There's an intelligence to these characters. There's a being there. There's something with emotions and feelings. And it's vitally important to allow the actor to communicate those feelings through. You never want to cover them up or hide them, and if you can help them, great, but I think it's really crucial that life, that spirit, that character is able to play through the makeup and the appliances. And I think the technology and the materials we have available to us now are helping us do that better than they ever have before.
As a creative person, reading those books is really inspirational because they're so narrative, they're so creative, there's so much within it that would describe in a creative way how this total fantasy world exists. So me being a creative person, I can delve into that and then take from it and utilize it and turn things into my own sort of fantasy world from what he's told us. When I thought about this character, I just saw a lot of darkness. I saw a lot of black, a lot of metal, a lot of pointy, jagged edges, and then a lot of kind of animal feeling, so a lot of matted fur, and I could just tell he would probably have really bad breath, have just a lot of evil to him.
It was perhaps the most interesting from a three-dimensional point of view because he was the most extensive character that we put together today. Had full prosthetic makeup, which is quite an involved process. We took molds, and from those molds we produced foam rubber appliances that were glued directly to the actor's head. The foam rubber is very supple, very flexible material, so that allowed us to get the range of expressions and the life to his face. And then on top of that was a cleverly airbrushed paint job, something to bring some skin tone and life to the character, but at the same time giving him sort of a rough, rugged kind of warrior-like look. Started with a kind of rugged, really monstrous character and then had to go to something the total opposite end of the spectrum, very refined, very subtle, very beautiful. The most obvious feature for us being the ears, so we created prosthetic ears that were glued on and blended in and made up to appear like the actress's own skin. But then further to that we added almost an iridescent golden sort of tones in the makeup. Just tried to sort of accentuate her. She already had a perfect face for the part, very angular, very graceful, and we just try to kind of accent some of those lines and bring up that, and just add a little bit of a fantasy element to it as well.
The fabric that I chose to use was a very sheer fabric that would move with the wind, so I could see this character running through the forest with her shimmery fabric trailing behind her, and then when you walk through the forest you see the sunlight shining through the trees and you see dappled bits of light and shade all over the forest floor. So I could see jewels being caught by the sun and shimmering, jewels on her fingers, jewels on her head as a crown. So I really went with this light idea. And then of course the makeup and prosthetics were so beautiful that it just pulled the whole character together. When I thought about this character, I thought about the earth element, so kind of dirty, covered in soot. The fibers of his clothes would have been made from flax or from something that you would find that was growing near his little home. So a lot of natural fibers, there was some wool as well. Very loose fitting clothes, very, not as flowing as the elf, but still very floppy clothes that would sort of drape or droop. But I guess I really went for just the earth element, so a lot of browns and natural fibers. He was very grounded, he was very earthy. When I thought about this character, I thought about an angelic character. He's passed into another realm in the fantasy world, or if we were to think of this world, he would have died and turned into an angel in some way. And you always see angels portrayed in white. He still has this extreme elegance to him, and the actor Frank, he had a very strong way of carrying himself and a lot of strength and elegance.
Every now and then, you know, sometimes you have to take someone that doesn't look much like their character at all and really do something drastic. He had a great face with lots of character and lots of lines, a very commanding face. All I did was try to accentuate some of that character that he already had, maybe make him look a little bit older, a little bit wiser, and try to give him, again, a little bit of a fantasy feel. Not so much that he didn't look real, but just to add a little bit of extra character to his face.
When he originally tried on the costume, I turned around and looked at him, and I was totally in awe of what I saw. And it was this man and the costume coming together, creating this mythical creature of immense proportions.
As fantastic as the characters are, I think you still want to be able to understand that there's a being in there. It's not just something you're looking at. It's something with feelings and emotions. The biggest challenge from the outset was not trying to repeat something that I'd seen before, trying to bring something of my own to it at the same time.
The publication of The Lord of the Rings created an explosion that reverberates even today. Readers who crave stories in which good always prevails and little people have the power to vanquish their foes now have a vast selection of books to choose from, thanks to J.R.R. Tolkien.
I think the reason fantasy has such a strong hold on us is because it resonates emotionally and intellectually at the very deepest level for all of us. All of us have dreams about snakes. All religions involve snakes, and the symbolism is used over and over again. You know, if readers do enjoy Bone and do take it, you know, seriously, it's because of my love of Tolkien and other fantasies. I have explored the deeper meaning of the symbols in them and the mythologies that are in them, and I have tried to build them into Bone from the very beginning. And you don't always have to know what these symbols, you don't have to know them to interpret them. They're just there and they mean something.
The Lord of the Rings has spawned not only countless literary imitators, but an entire range of multimedia products. Fantasy role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons and Magic: The Gathering borrow liberally from Tolkien's creations and have become just as popular as the original trilogy.
When you play Dungeons and Dragons, there's got to be, it's almost like acting sitting down. You don't actually get up and do anything, but you have to assume the role of someone else. You'll find that most people into Dungeons and Dragons have sort of a, you know, sort of the hidden ham inside them, the hidden actor that kind of wants to get out. A lot of it is built on the whole quest idea. I mean, the whole thing. I mean, that's the whole thing of Dungeons and Dragons. You're a group of people who may or may not want to be thrown into this quest, but there's something that has to be done. They deal with real issues, the characters. They have layers to them. There's you know, real fears and racism and you know, love and hate. There's actual depth to the characters.
When it comes to this particular aspect of role-playing, in terms of The Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien wrote in a way that was so connected to a medievalist sensibility, I think that there is a way in which people who engage in that form of role-playing are connecting themselves to parts of our real human history, and that maybe parts of humanity that have been lost to us. Fans who really delved into role-playing to the extent of developing costumes, going to conferences in costume and so on, might be searching in a way for an aspect of an identity that had been missing for them, perhaps developmentally, and something that they were looking in a way to resolve.
Despite the success and influence of The Lord of the Rings, the Tolkien classic was never fully exploited by the collectibles market. Then came the news of a major Hollywood adaptation, and with it, an entire line of games and toys based on the trilogy.
There's going to be a whole string of collectible statues, porcelain statues that are going to run anywhere from $50 to $100. There'll be action figures, there are posters, there are calendars. We're going to sell tons of that stuff. We're selling promotional calendars that they had done for the film, and they were going at $50 a calendar. People didn't even blink at buying.
From 6 to 60, fans could now relive the grand drama of the trilogy through board games, card games, and the ultimate fantasy escape, role-playing and video games.
Fantasy and role-playing, I mean, Tolkien is considered the forefather of, modern fantasy fiction, that it just lends itself so well to a game. It's going to be amazing for a hardcore fan to have seemingly, this freedom that's just amazing to walk around these virtual worlds that are set in this Lord of the Rings universe. I think the main appeal to fantasy video games is the fact that although it is linear in structure, that is, there's a beginning and there's an ending, how you get there isn't usually entirely up to you. A very good game, a good game design that allows you to explore multiple avenues to get to the same end result. So in a game like Diablo or Baldur's Gate, or maybe in this upcoming Lord of the Rings game, what happens is you can do side quests or sub quests. You can talk to multiple characters. You get to assume your own role. You can choose your own name. You can choose your attributes, and you grow and experience. I think with the internet, video games can be preserved just like books can, really, because you can go back, and I know myself, I can go on the net, and I'm surfing in cyberspace, and I can find some games that I played when I was like 15 years old, 10 years old. You can go back, and because of the internet, because of the fact that it's such an effective distribution medium, and it's this vast worldwide resource of storing all these files, that sure, one day you can go back and not just read the J.R.R. Tolkien books, but you can go back and find that game that you played.
Attempts to bring The Lord of the Rings to the big screen date back to the 1960s, when United Artists bought the film rights to the trilogy. Tolkien, however, was never keen on film, television, or radio adaptations of his book, and it would be 5 years after his death before a movie was produced. In 1978, The Lord of the Rings was transformed into a 133-minute animated feature by director Ralph Bakshi.
Basically, they film live action, and then they trace over it,
yeah.
And people didn't enjoy that so much.
I thought it was kind of cool because it was very literal in its adaptation of the book.
What it had obviously sort of failed to do was to find a way of cinematically bringing what to a lot of people was a very rich and powerful and compelling universe to the screen.
Adapting Tolkien's work was proving difficult. In 1979, an animated version of The Hobbit was made for TV. Produced with the children's market in mind, the movie was criticized by some adult fans for oversimplifying the complex tale. Almost 2 decades would pass before another filmmaker, native New Zealander Peter Jackson, would revisit The Lord of the Rings.
I was happy to see that a director with a very distinctive personality and a very distinctive vision, and I think with a real sensitivity to the Tolkien universe, was going to be taking on the project. He will be the right choice if the movie is allowed to have, as I say, some kind of distinctive personality.
His imagination, I think, is sufficient, obviously, to go from bad taste to heavenly creatures to the frighteners to Lord of the Rings. I think that just the mere fact that you can't associate him with one specific movie or one specific genre makes him good for this. Makes him, it was the idea of getting David Lynch to direct Dune.
Right.
I thought that was the perfect choice. You get someone who thinks eccentrically, who thinks artistically, to tackle this kind of thing. Then you let him do it. You let him do it. And I think that's what bodes well for Lord of the Rings, is that New Line has let him make this thing in his own on his own terms, in his own turf, with his own people. If you're gonna commit to someone like Peter Jackson, commit to him, let him do it. And that seems to be what's happened.
It's a kind of fantasy that asks you to accept a complete alternate world. And that world has to have its own logic, its own kind of reality. And we accept that provided the logic is consistent and the logic is complete. And we accept that also provided the certain kind of, synthetic attributes to that world, the way that it looks, the makeup, the language, that kind of stuff, whether that is consistent, whether that is real. So in other words, it's a weird kind of thing because You have to take something which is really a kind of, a riff on the imagination, a flight of the imagination, but you have to get it right down to the most specific details. So in other words, you have to be completely anal about something which is totally artificial.
Now you've got cinematic technology that is at an unprecedented level of development. So just when you think you've seen it all, they might have something. They might have come up with something
they
even
might,
more.
yeah,
you know?
yeah. I don't know. I hope so, because I hate to think that I've seen it all.
In the summer of 2000, New Line Cinema released the first preview of the Lord of the Rings new film on its website. The brief trailer was downloaded more than 1.7 million times on the first day, more than twice the number of downloads received by the trailer for Star Wars Episode I: The Phantom Menace. The countdown to full-scale Lord of the Rings mania was on. It's impossible to imagine what modern fantasy might be like had Tolkien succumbed to that tarantula bite as a child. So much of today's fantasy draws upon the blueprint he created with The Lord of the Rings that perhaps without him the genre wouldn't even exist. 50 years after The Lord of the Rings made its appearance, J.R.R. Tolkien's vision is alive and well.
As technology advances along with Tolkien's popularity, the two will come together. That's inevitable. And I don't believe in burying your head in the sand. I think that's just silly. A lot of this is very, very positive. As long as people read the books. My only fear is that people won't read the books. They will go to the games and the videos and whatever else is available and not actually go to the books and read what is in there, because no movie, and certainly no game, can ever capture anything like the real flavor of the book. Because part of the greatness of the books is that every person who reads The Lord of the Rings has a different interpretation. What the characters were, what they sounded like, what they did to a large extent. Any movie or game depiction is going to be one person's view. And it could be the most marvelous one. And again, there's a danger people will say, well, it's not my view, thus it's not valid. No, not true at all. It's valid, but it may not be yours. But you have to go back to the book.
When I read The Lord of the Rings, I felt better about myself as a person. I knew the world I was living with, I was living in, but I felt somehow as if I had gone through that same journey. And I think that's what he wanted his readers to experience.
For many readers, the British author's name is synonymous with fantasy, and the enduring characters and stories he created literally changed the world. To date, the 4 books that comprise The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings have sold more than 100 million copies worldwide and have been translated into 26 different languages. Societies of Tolkien fans meet in over a dozen countries from Norway to Brazil, and all points in between on the internet. In the end, J.R.R. Tolkien did much more than write a best-selling and influential story. He created an entirely new mythology, stirring elements of history, folklore, and fiction into his ever-vivid imagination. He breathed new life into a timeless tradition. Perhaps the true genius of Tolkien is that he was both an inventive storyteller and a great scholar, capable of drawing from the deep well of myth, legend, and literature to keep ancient traditions alive in the modern age.
I love his books, I love the writing, I love what he stood for. And he does stand for something which has been misplaced, if not lost. Part of the resentment of his success in the surveys and polls around the millennium was that the new writer is very different from the writer of Tolkien's era, and they didn't really like what he stood for. I do like what he stood for. It was something which is perfect, actually. It's pristine. It is a nobility and a grace which is often lost today. People think that to write a convincing book, you have to splash around in the gutter. You don't have to do that. There are fascinating stories deep down. There are fascinating stories when you look up high as well, and Tolkien did that. He always looked up high.
On September 2nd, 1973, J.R.R. Tolkien passed away. In a fitting tribute, the London Daily Telegraph obituary stated, "Bilbo found a scrap of black twist and tied it round his arm. the little hobbit wept bitterly. Somewhere in the world of fantasy that Professor J.R.R. Tolkien created, this is happening at the news of his death. His creatures were so real, elf princes, hobbits, ents, trolls, orcs, and other grim enemies, that the Merton Professor of English has acquired, like them, a certain timelessness. He was Gandalf, the ageless wizard, appearing and shaping the destiny of vast upland kingdoms, full of imagery and the twilight of prehistory. Even at the ripe age of 81, it is sad to lose one who brought so much fresh air and poetry into our literature. The kingdoms that he created will not pass away.